Good evening, friends. So this is my first video of the year 2018. Unfortunately, just after New Year's, I came down with a very bad case of the flu, and I've been out of commission since then. But in the meantime, I've had no shortage of people asking me to do one particular quick take, one particular after-action analysis about a live stream that took place on Andy Worski's channel. Coincidentally, on the same day, I became violently ill. Now, when this request first came out, I thought, oh, I know I've missed the boat. The flu's gonna have me down, and by the time I come out of it and am able to record anything, people will have lost interest in the live stream. No one will be talking about it anymore. But sure enough, a week has passed and people are still talking about this. In fact, the live stream has kind of taken on a life of its own, kicking off discussion after discussion, multiple analysis YouTube videos, and even one cartoon parody. And so despite the typical short lifespan of live streams on YouTube, this particular discussion just seems to have taken on a certain amount of immortality. It seems like the dynamic in the YouTube ideas community has fundamentally changed. And of course, by now, I'm pretty sure everyone knows that I'm talking about the quote-unquote debate between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer of the alt-right. Now, of course, it wasn't even really a debate in the formal sense, and Sargon and Richard Spencer weren't even the only participants. I think after the Kraut debacle, Andy Worski was really hoping to open up dialogue, to sort of give the devil its due, to basically have an airing of the grievances against the alt-right in a way that seemed more honest than what was going on in the previous 4 months. And what better way to air grievances than having YouTube's most prominent quote-unquote skeptic engage in an honest and open debate against, well, America's most primary representative of the alt-right, Richard Spencer. And indeed, going into it, I think Andy Worski knew that this would be a big event. People were really hyping it up. I think I heard about it for days in advance, which, you know, for people who are unfamiliar with YouTube, it's really unusual to hear a lot of buzz about a live stream well in advance of it actually happening. But at any rate, the live stream happened. It went on for 4 hours, and in between me taking my cold medicine, I was able to push through watching most of it, because it was not a pleasant discussion to watch by any stretch of the imagination. I remember watching it and thinking, oh man, based on my previous videos, people are going to want me to comment on this discussion when there really is no discussion going on. I mean, I already said it wasn't a formal debate. Indeed, it wasn't. But watching the whole interaction, I got the sense that Andy Worski didn't even know how to really manage people when they were having a casual conversation. He was running it like a morning radio announcer, cutting in at really weird times, interrupting the conversation when it was finally getting interesting. And simultaneously, he seemed to have very little capacity to understand the concepts being talked about or the ideas being discussed. I mean, I think he took a super chat at one point asking Spencer's opinion on Locke, and he pronounced it Loki. Of course, this made him, as a moderator, totally incapable of asking clarifying questions to his guests. So already there were some troubles. But of course, the troubles by no means ended with the moderator. The two primary litigants in this discussion, or whatever you want to call it, were certainly responsible for how this conversation proceeded. Now, of course, because of the very informal nature of this conversation, there were many people involved, and it wasn't really clear if they were definitive sides or if it was a conversation between many different individual perspectives. Of course, the two main players were Sargon of Akkad from the skeptic community and Richard Spencer representing the alt-right. But at various times, Richard Spencer was joined by Jean-Francois Gobry, Millennial Woes, and Sargon of Akkad had several guests on, including Styx Hexenhammer and V. And of course, I mean, all 3 or 6 of these people, they had varying degrees of opinions on the subjects being discussed, but broadly, it seemed that there was a definitive alt-right and a definitive liberal or skeptic side forming up. Even though it seemed that, for the most part, JF or Jean-Francois Gobry was sort of playing the center, trying to act like a pseudo-moderator in place of Andy Worski. So already even the setup should give you an idea of how incredibly confused this quote-unquote discussion was even in its conception. But what ultimately resulted? Well, what resulted was, to my discernment, a little more than an intellectual version of professional wrestling. Or should I say, really, really bad and incompetent professional wrestling. You had all the parties parties involved just dish out these huge theatrical boilerplates and then charge at each other with punches, and in this case, arguments that didn't connect to anything. You had people in the discussion essentially tagging in and out, with Andy Worski being the moderator. Essentially, the only thing he did to offer any balance was seemingly bring someone in from the other side when another person left. So as Styx Hexenhammer went out, V came in. As V went out, Kevin Logan came in, and I could even imagine Andy Worski being sort of a pro wrestling announcer going, "Here comes a new challenger." It was ridiculous. I mean, this is totally off topic, but for people who are running a discussion, it's not so much about keeping the two sides balanced as it is keeping the two sides obtaining some mutual understanding. I'm perfectly fine discussing my opinions with two other progressives as long as the moderator does something to make sure that they're understanding the points I'm making, as opposed to simply attacking strawmen. Now, I don't want to discount the effect of having two people talk down to you and the additional mic time that comes with having more voices on one side than the other. But when you're discussing a confusing issue, you can't just bring people on to keep things balanced, because each of the individual litigants, I don't really know what else to call them, they all have their own perspectives, and so it just adds to the confusion. And of course, to add to all of this, I mean, in addition to Worski, you also had JF doing his sort of pseudo-moderation thing. And if I'm going to sort of stretch the analogy to wrestling a little bit, I would imagine that JF would be sort of like a mischievous fan who every time one of the wrestlers is knocked down, he would run up and attach something sharp to that wrestler's gloves with the intention of making that wrestler more deadly when he got back into the ring. Of course, each of the wrestlers never landing a punch, that person would just dislocate their arm with the additional weight. In short, JF's attempt to make the conversation more interesting did nothing of the sort. It only further confused the litigants and led to just this disaster of a conversation. But again, I think this analogy might be sort of detracting from my analysis of what actually went on. And regardless of the roles that these people's plus ones added to the conversation, or should I say didn't add to the conversation, the discussion was mainly led by an interaction between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer. This is the reason why thousands of people tuned in to see this on the Worski's channel. This is the reason why they picked up thousands of dollars in super chats. People wanted to see Sargon confront Richard Spencer. So how did this confrontation go? Well, in some sense, it really didn't. Sargon early on took this incredulous attitude towards Spencer. It was very apparent he wanted to discredit the alt-right, and it was also very apparent that he was very impatient to get to some way he could discredit the alt-right. The Sargon that appeared in this discussion was not the Sargon that asked 20 questions before rounding in on his critique, the way he did when he interviewed Jared Taylor. The Sargon that came to the Worski stream was a Sargon that wanted to demonstrate that the alt-right could be discounted prima facie, on the surface, without any extended investigation. I think this is sort of a very common way that people in the mainstream deal with the alt-right. They don't want to get into a long discussion with it. They just want to demonstrate that it's manifestly false and move on. And I could tell Sargon was in a similar position. And the way he went about doing this was basically trying to use definitions. Now, I mean, every now and again there are good arguments that stem from claiming that a certain concept or idea is incoherent, but for the most part, it's really a bad strategy in a discussion to start arguing over definitions of things. In this case, Sargon took a quite common progressive or liberal tactic, which was to ask for really, really well-defined boundaries on certain social categories. Now, I think we're all aware of how this happens with gender and sex. The left has claimed that, well, gender is undefinable because there are people who skirt the boundaries of gender, and now they're claiming that even biological sex is not a coherent concept because there are people who are in the boundaries between the sexes. I mean, on the face of it, it's not a strong argument. Right up front, it suffers from the fact that in order to accept that lack of understanding about categories, in order to say we can disassemble a category that is statistically salient, if it has some outlying cases, we essentially lose resolution on any kind of category whatsoever that isn't 100% deterministic, which is most categories in nature. You lose all distinction between species, you lose all distinction in between categories of things like stars, nebula, and planets. I mean, all of these things have boundary cases to them, but we understand categories as being statistical groupings, clusterings. And I think Sargon understands this in other contexts, but nonetheless, in this debate, his main strategy was to use this critique critique of categories generally to go after Richard Spencer's and indeed the alt-right's concept of whiteness. Now again, I don't think there's no merit to this approach. I mean, the category boundaries on whiteness for the kind of thing that Richard Spencer is proposing are super important. I mean, Richard Spencer is proposing public policy that would require people to be divided. And that does require a bright line. That's more than just using cluster groups for purposes of intellectual discussion. So I'm not saying that there's no valid argument inside where Sargon was trying to go with that, but for the most part in this discussion, his strategy came down to pretending like he didn't understand what Richard Spencer was saying. And this was all the more bizarre because Richard Spencer himself seemed to take a similar strategy. He wanted to pretend he didn't understand. Every time someone like Styx Hexenhammer or Sargon would bring in an objection, Richard Spencer would take this tone as if he'd just been asked something by a 5-year-old, as if the question wasn't coherent at its face. And I think this was largely a face-saving tactic on the part of Spencer. I think if you're going into a discussion, you always want to seem aloof, above it all. If your opponent isn't engaging with you, you don't want to act like you're super invested in the debate while they're going, oh, it's all incoherent, oh, you're just ridiculous. It makes you look like a simpering, weak person who's asking for permission to have an opinion. And if there's one good thing Richard Spencer does, it's projecting an image of confidence. And that's very much the kind of strategy he took here. I'll just pretend that what they're saying is beneath me. I don't understand it. It's not coherent. They're being autistic, to borrow a popular internet expression for people who are utterly focused on minutia and don't look at the big picture. It's sort of the debate tactic you might get from someone who'd taken, classes on executive confidence. I remember there was this character from the show Futurama who was sort of this archetypical executive, and whenever anyone brought to him a problem X, he would go, X, you're not looking at the big picture, regardless of what the problem was. It could be that the spaceship they were in was crashing. He would just respond to the fact that this was a detail, and it's a common tactic to look like you're more confident and bigger than the person who's bringing the problem to your attention. So that was the dynamic that came about in the first 30 minutes, that Sargon and Spencer discussed the issue of the alt-right and the concept of an ethnostate, and over the next 2 hours, it did not change. It got more dramatic, it got less dramatic. It had JF continuously trying to throw curveballs into an already confused discussion. It had the far too occasional attempts to clarify the issue under discussion and get everyone back on track. But the general dynamic did not change. It was a clusterfuck from beginning to end. The only thing that did change over the course of the conversation was the amount of money that the Worskies made on the stream, because people continuously dropped super chats for $100, $200, $500 with the most inane questions on them imaginable. It was hard to believe, and after a few hours of watching this, my head was pounding, and it might have been the flu, but regardless, just the inanity of the conversation itself probably would have driven me to that. It seemed on the surface like a 4-hour conversation where almost nothing was achieved. So initially when I left off with this video, I was thinking to myself, oh man, people are going to ask me to do after action analysis of this debate, and it's just, there's not going to be anything worth saying. And indeed, probably if just this stream had happened and nothing else had occurred around the stream, if no additional analysis had gone on, perhaps it wouldn't be worth discussing. But seeing how the discussion progressed in cooler live streams, in discussions after the fact, and upon rewatching the initial quote-unquote debate between Spencer and Sargon, I have been left thinking that this interaction has been oddly clarifying. And I'm hoping that I can explain why here. I think what we saw in the discussion between Sargon and Richard Spencer on the Worski channel was the interaction between two internet communities that had really been coming to head for the last year and a half, pretty much since I started this YouTube channel. The alt-right had been a thorn in the side of the skeptic community, the broad range of anti-feminist, liberal, atheist YouTubers that had become very prominent in years previous to 2016. The skeptic YouTube channels had encountered the alt-right. Undoubtedly, the alt-right was a growing online presence, but no one in that community really had a good way of interacting with I mean, we all know how the left interacts with the alt-right, or should I say, doesn't interact with the alt-right. They just ostracize them. They don't platform them. They never answer their questions. The difficulty with the skeptic community is, one, the very concept of their presence on the internet was one that brought to the forefront the need for debate and discussion, that held a dialectic to be sort of the primary good in any kind of discernment over what was good or bad, or what was a proper opinion or improper opinion. Moreover, a lot of the skeptics were similarly deplatformed by the progressives. They couldn't in turn endorse a deplatforming attempt. Otherwise, they would, in many ways, vindicate a lot of the strategies that were being used against them by the progressives in universities and in other venues that they hoped to actually participate in. But nevertheless, the skeptics had never really come up with a good way of interacting with the alt-right. The typical strategy involved dismissing them, saying that their designs would never happen, and essentially claiming that none of their arguments needed to be really taken seriously. But as the alt-right channels grew in prominence, as they started entering the mainstream news, this just didn't cut it anymore. And after some very embarrassing attempts to discredit some of the factual claims the alt-right was making, I think Sargon saw this interaction with Richard Spencer as being a template for how the skeptic community would set itself aside from the alt-right, to demonstrate to the other people who indeed followed Sargon's brand of liberalism exactly how the alt-right could be confronted in a dialectic, and how people of the anti-feminist, anti-progressive, liberal, skeptic community could set themselves aside from the alt-right that is growing rather steadily on YouTube. So that broadly was the goal of Sargon. Now, what could we say might be the goal of Richard Spencer and his sort of partner Millennial Woes in this debate? Well, I think Spencer's goals were really to demonstrate that the alt-right was a mature political movement, that it wasn't just for angsty teenagers and spurgy neets living in their parents' basements. This has largely been the goal of Spencer generally, but I think he knew that this interaction with Sargon on the Worski stream would be a turning point for the movement, a way that it could establish itself as something that needed to be taken seriously. He was getting a lot of new views, and he wanted to come off as being the more mature person. Hence, I think, most of his attitude and presentation during the debate. And I think it's looking at both of these goals that the two parties had that we might be able to see better why I think this interaction and similar interactions that follow it are really going to set the tone for the dialogue, at least on YouTube, going forward. But let's start with Sargon. Did Sargon achieve his goals? How was his approach in this debate effective insofar as it led to some kind of response the skeptic community could have towards the alt-right? Well, here I'm going to have to back up a little bit, because I think that most people who watch this debate, who watch this discussion, they probably thought that Sargon did a pretty bad job. He certainly came off as condescending. He never seemed like he really engaged with any of the serious questions, even though, frankly, with the exception of Millennial Woes, there really weren't very many serious questions coming from Spencer. But at any rate, I think most people were disappointed with Sargon's performance, but to be perfectly fair, Sargon was in a very difficult position, because I think the critique they bring to the skeptics and indeed towards modern society in general, it's very basic, it's very tight, and there are only a few real ways to address it. This critique obviously being that group differences are in some ways unreconcilable, all other groups have in-group preferences, have in-group loyalties, therefore white nationalism or white identity politics should naturally flow from that. It's a fast argument, it's very tight, and again, there's really only three ways you can address it. You can find some way to dismiss it, and here, of course, the fastest way to dismiss this argument is just simply to deplatform it like the left does, to simply shut it out. To either say the idea of discussing white identity politics is so odious that we can't even entertain it, or to, like Sargon did, try to claim that the positions don't have any meaning, that they're incoherent because the categories being used aren't coherently defined. The second way to address this particular argument when it comes from the alt-right is to attack the factual premises in which it's based on. Now, there are numerous factual premises that the alt-right uses in order to demonstrate that intergroup cohesion is an illusion and not attainable, but certainly the elephant in the room is what they call race realism. The claim that there are biological differences in group intelligences that can never really be reconciled by any amount of culture or education. Now, the alt-right loves debating this, because if this fact is accepted as true or likely true, it utterly destroys the basis for both liberal technocratic societies and also progressive egalitarianism. And at a very emotional level, it immediately suggests the alt-right position of racial loyalty. But of course, this gets me to the third way that you can approach the alt-right. And the third way you can approach the alt-right is to dig deeper, to try to come up with a philosophical contradiction, to point out larger issues, to demonstrate many of the internal contradictions of trying to combine race, populism, and nationalism into one movement and sell it to modern people without any reference to culture or faith, to essentially point out the larger philosophical contradictions in the alt-right that will eventually lead it to not obtain the very goals it fights for. And of course, as people who are listening to this who are familiar with my channel might know, this is indeed the tactic I took against the alt-right in my series, What's Wrong with the Alt-Right? And it's by far the least popular approach to attacking this movement. And for understandable reasons. The approach of philosophically discrediting the alt-right, I mean, first of all, it's abstract, so you're going to miss a lot of people who don't really care about higher order notions of culture and meaning and the like. But at a more basic and practical level, the cultural left and everyone affiliated with the cultural left, which is to say all of mainstream society, has decided that the alt-right will not be platformed. And furthermore, they have decided that anybody who engages in a dialectic with the alt-right is enabling them. I mean, you can see this directly from the Anti-Defamation League's watch lists that identifies people who interview alt-right people, like ironically enough, Roaming Millennial, as being enablers of the alt-right. And I mean, for people who are trying to break into the mainstream, that's really difficult. I mean, Roaming Millennial has had to continually apologize for even interviewing Richard Spencer, and she's non-white herself. So at a basic level, it's really, really hard to have a dialectic with the alt-right. And if you're taking this more philosophical approach, it really necessitates that there's some channel of communication, that you're really seriously learning about what the alt-right really thinks and then critiquing it at a deep level. And to do that requires you to listen to them. And to the left, that's taboo. I mean, even in my own series about the alt-right, it still somewhat unsettles me because I know I have a lot of friends who are, well, I wouldn't say progressive, but certainly on the more liberal side of Catholicism, and they look at my approach that I used in the alt-right series, where I essentially granted the alt-right its factual premises and simply critiqued them on a philosophical level. They almost look at that as a betrayal. Anything that isn't an outright moral dismissal is just unacceptable. And that's unusual because it's not that I don't see anything that isn't immoral about the alt-right. Indeed, they have a lot of very immoral parts to many of their positions. But I tend to see these problems as being a little bit deeper down, as not being something that can prima facie dismiss them from a conversation. I mean, obviously, if someone is advocating for genocide, I think you can rightfully use moral condemnation to prima facie exclude them from a conversation. But for most of the serious thinkers on the alt-right, any kind of immoral contradiction inside their ideology is really buried far down. But for people who are even a little bit sympathetic to the left side of the spectrum, they see an engagement at that level is in some sense a betrayal. All right, so in essence, to respond to the alt-right, that leaves you with what amounts to two weapons. You can dismiss them using deplatforming or some trick, or you can answer their factual claims. Now, I've sort of mentioned in passing that this Warski stream, it was really kicked off by the utter implosion of Kraut and T. Now, I'm not necessarily connecting Kraut and T's attempt to debunk the factual basis of the alt-right to his really obsessive and monomaniacal attempts to personally discredit people he thought were on the alt-right. And I'm certainly not qualified to comment on the likelihood of some of the claims of race realism being true. But what I can point out, and certainly the specter that was hanging over this entire discussion, was The utter failure of a 6-month research attempt to debunk the strong factual claims of the alt-right, utterly failing to land a single point that could discredit the alt-right's main message. True, someone might do it in the future, but to this date, all the skeptic community has been able to come up with is failure. And it was that failure that Sargon was trying to live down on the Worski stream. And I sympathize because in many ways, Sargon has shown an attempt to try to engage and discredit the right wing in a more thoughtful, philosophical way. Indeed, he had Jared Taylor on his channel for a discussion in which he offered a much more lengthy critique after sort of investigating the stronger claims that the alt-right was making. But that was in an unannounced stream that had very little attention paid to it, and that had come during a rather cool period in the community. When the Worski stream happened, all eyes were on that discussion, including probably the eyes of the mainstream, and Sargon, I think, rightfully realized that coming up with a loose and abstract critique of the alt-right really wasn't going to cut it. That coming up with a loose and abstract critique of the alt-right might actually damage his ability to interact with the mainstream. And so he was just left with option 1, dismissal. Now, that's not to say he couldn't have done a little bit better. I mean, certainly his partner in the debate, Styx Hexenhammer, came up with a much more lucid counter-critique of implementing the alt-right's goal of an ethno-state, which was indeed a much, much, much more pointed attack than Sargon pretending like he didn't understand how statistical categories could exist. But at any rate, I think the more interesting reflections that Sargon and his sort of attached cohort came up with occurred in many of the live streams that followed this debate. Because I think in those discussions, Sargon came to realize that this statistical categories don't real plus group or collective identity is not liberal. Those arguments aren't going to play indefinitely. Or if they are, they're going to need some more philosophical basis for them. After a few live streams, it was apparent that Sargon was putting some thought into this, and you could even see it in a video that came out the week after the debate where Sargon is looking forward into 2018 and saying, we need to do something, even I think proposing a new label, liberalist, for a movement that can take back classical liberalism and forge it into something positive. And I think much of the impetus just came from the realization that the dismissive, shut-the-door attitude that he brought to the debate against the alt-right just really wasn't going to cut it. Now, I have to say that I'm, in some sense, very encouraged by the fact that Sargon is venturing forth and trying to develop a positive philosophy, something that can be activist and move ideas forward in some direction, not just in a reactive direction. Indeed, trying to stir some of that impetus in Sargon was part of the motivation for originally making my series about why Sargon would eventually lose to the SJWs, which I think to this date is still my most popular topical video. But here, just looking at this latest attempt, I mean, it has all of the same problems. I mean, don't get me wrong, certainly one of the main problems of the skeptic community of atheism was that it was naturally negative, that it was naturally something that only said, we don't want things that way, we don't want this belief in God, we don't want this belief in social justice, we don't want this belief, leave us alone, etc., etc., etc. It's just a lack of belief. And indeed, I've made fun of it's a lack of belief atheists, it's a pet peeve of mine, but indeed, you know, the philosophy was at its essence very, very negative, and for a while that's all they needed to do. And I think reading a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, as Sargon appears to be in the process of doing, he believes he's found something there in the late 18th century and the early 19th century that can be used to hold up something positive. And that something is liberalism. Liberalism with a capital L. The philosophy of the founding fathers, the philosophy of Locke, or Loki, as Andy Worski would have it, or the philosophy of Thomas Paine. We're going to carry forward the Scottish Enlightenment, perhaps sprinkle some Kant in to fill in the holes when it comes to epistemology and defining metaphysics. But all in all, the banner is the banner of enlightenment. The banner of individualism, and only collectivism to the extent that that collective is shown to be directly amenable to individual thriving. So, of course, as you might have, there's a problem with this, and that is that this entire idea that liberalism can hoist itself up by its own bootstraps is just, in my assessment, fundamentally flawed. People have already tried it, and it generally doesn't work out. And one of the reasons why it doesn't work out is that people don't really understand how metaphysical beliefs work. And much of this is just due to the distinct lack of awareness on the part of liberals themselves. They can't see that they themselves have metaphysical presuppositions. They can't see that they themselves have a culture that in many ways reinforces their own beliefs, and that that culture does more than many of the decisions they make to choose liberalism over another ideology. I mean, you can just take as an example the frequent liberal and sometimes progressive notion that we can just arrive at a certain view of the universe, put it on trial, and if it fails, we just discard it, regardless of how much tradition it has behind it, regardless of how much it's helped our ancestors. If it cannot justify itself to us right now, we have to get rid of it. And of course, this view was sort of on display in a lot of the videos I reviewed by King Crocoduck. It's a fairly frequent aphorism you hear by people on the liberal or progressive side. The problem is that at the end, nothing can stand up to this belief. The only reason why some people assert that they do this is because they're holding their own beliefs as some kind of secret default of humanity. That in the absence of any belief, people will come back to the way I think. Now, if you're a person who has a very minimalistic belief system like libertarianism, if you come from a very homogenous culture, or if your ideology happens to be in vogue in the academy, or just in your social circle, it can be very tempting to believe this. But a careful study of history and other cultures just puts the lie to this through and through. Humanity does not default to a liberal state. It defaults to, if anything, an authoritarian one. It defaults to a collectivist one, and if anything in what Richard Spencer said was true, the naturalness of the collective identity is certainly his most salient point, because it is very natural if it is not base. But once you acknowledge that caveat and put liberalism itself on trial, which in many ways it was by their progressive and what some people call cultural Marxist critics, then liberalism itself can be dethroned, as it has in modern universities. Now, I know liberals have some counter-critiques to this. Later on in the Enlightenment, with Thomas Paine and with Kant and a lot of these other people, and even in a lot of thinkers like Robert Nozick in the 20th century, they've come up with sort of ways to justify liberalism in this very abstract way, by really only recognizing that individuals exist and then sort of putting the onus on everybody else to challenge that point of view. They'll say something similar to what Sargon said in our last conversation. We're having this dialectic and people are involved in it as individuals, and that's how we claim rights and considerations as individuals. Now, of course, this obviously falls into the previous problems we discussed about sort of seizing presumption. But the other big problem is, even if we were to adopt this perspective of pure individualism for our society going forward, it leaves out the critical step. And the critical step that liberalism leaves out and has left out in previous generations are intergenerational transmission. How do you justify the creation of new generations? How do you justify the transmission of your culture to new generations? How do you instill new generations with the identity and the cultural wherewithal to actually embrace your liberal principles on the other side of a generational divide? Because in that break, there is no individualism. The life of the father ends and the life of the son continues on. And in that exchange, an appeal needs to be made by the father to the son. An appeal needs to be made from the ancestor to the descendant. And in some sense, in a converse way, when people are deciding whether to have children or not, an appeal needs to be made by the unborn descendant upon the person currently living, upon the individual currently living, that they need to sacrifice for generations yet to come. But of course, those two voices, the voices of the ancestors in the past and the voices of generations yet to be born, are totally absent from this dialectic Sargon is imagining, and they're totally absent from a conversation that only involves individuals that are currently living. It's kind of funny that the alt-right calls people who are individualists, classical conservatives, neoconservatives, they call them cucks. It's short for cuckold. I think it comes from some kind of fetish porn, but it has a classical corollary as a man who's raising another man's son, unbeknownst to him, as a man who's let his own genetic line slip from his grasp, as somebody who's let his own heritage be taken from him. And I think we see in that image one of the critical flaws of liberalism, because we might ask ourselves, does a man have the right to ask that his descendants have the same culture as he does? Does a man have the right to ask that his descendants have the same genes as he does? I mean, most classical ethical systems would say yes, but you're going to have a hard time finding justification for that in the very individualistic notions that Sargon is using to justify liberalism. But in that deficit is more than just a sort of cutting and mean internet putdown. It's also the critical flaw that will be the final undoing of any intergenerational civilization that tries to embrace only this pure individualistic liberalism. That civilization at some point will have to justify its own continuation beyond the lifespans of its current members. And if it cannot do that, it will be, for a better word, cucked. It will be, for a better word, replaced by other genetics and other ideas that take prominence, that claim to be better than the ones it's promoting. At first, during the transition of power, those ideas will claim to be perfectly liberal and be inheritors of the liberal civilization that's essentially handing power over to them. But as we've seen in the case of the progressives, and we may see in the case of new Islamic populations in Europe, that guarantee means nothing one generation down from the power transfer. And without a genuine notion of heritage, at least in the cultural sense, if not in the genetic one, no civilization can carry itself forward like this. And indeed, I've made this point to Sargon before, and maybe I'll get something through to him again when we have another conversation. But at the moment, I've probably beaten his role in this entire dialectic to death. So let me move on to Spencer, sort of the dark mirror for the problems that Sargon is trying to address. Now, in the wake of Sargon's rather lackluster performance in this discussion, I think a lot of people were left thinking that Richard Spencer must have been left the victor. He must have made himself look good. In fact, I mean, the entire engagement between them sort of reminded me of that Monty Python skit where the upper class twits are in a contest over who can shoot themselves in the head the fastest. Because Richard Spencer was totally undermining his goals every time he opened his mouth. Again, Richard Spencer was there, presumably to demonstrate that the alt-right had come of age. It was a serious movement. It was the mature way of looking at the world. The alt-right was for adults who didn't have to have reality sugarcoated in order to look at the grim decisions that might necessarily confront us in the future. And I'm sorry to say, if that was his goal, if appealing to any kind of mainstream adult audience was his goal, he utterly failed. Now, Richard Spencer was back on the Warskis for another live stream. And at this moment, his quotes from either livestream are kind of getting mixed up in my head a bit. But throughout the entire conversation, when he wasn't just dismissing Sargon, Richard Spencer would go off on these insane tangents about the white ethnostate and how it would have a space program and how we would conquer the moon and conquer Mars and how we needed to have nuclear weapons in this white ethnostate. And all the while, people are familiar with Richard Spencer and how he talks. I mean, he comes off as sort of this opportunist and a con man. And so listening to him talk about all of these Promethean endeavors he wanted the white race to engage in, it was like some 1950s snake oil salesman who had just been reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra coming to give a lecture at a community college. I mean, there was so much windy rhetoric you could hardly keep it straight. And if one was just to take Sargon out of the picture and leave aside sort of his dismissiveness and the whole endeavor, and you just listen to Spencer carry on about the stuff, the optics would just be terrible. There is no way that could be communicated to a mainstream audience with any effect. So for a moment, leaving aside the moral problems with white nationalism and the incredible humanitarian disaster that might arise from trying to form a white ethnostate, Spencer came off as someone who was LARPing, who had absolutely no handle on reality. I mean, and Richard Spencer is not some guy with a YouTube channel. He's not some random blogger. He is the face of the alt-right. He is their public figure. He's the guy that goes on CNN. He is the guy who has all of the spotlights pointed at him. He's the guy who gives the keynote at their convention. And he goes on one of the more popular live streams on YouTube, which he knows that the mainstream is looking at. And he goes on about white ethnostates in space and nuclear-armed white nationalism. I mean, remember, too, that the alt-right aspires to be a political movement that actually wants to have populist appeal. Nobody is going to go for this ever. Everybody knows the deep humanitarian cost it would require to form some kind of white ethnostate that had sovereignty inside the continental United States. And I know, of course, the alt-righters are going to be pointing to the examples of the Ukraine and the division of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan as a prime example of how ethnostates can be formed, but those examples could not be implemented implemented in any modern Western country. For those not convinced, just take a 1989 map out of the USSR, and you're looking at the unified collection of Soviet republics, and just take a pen out and draw a rough circle around where 70% of the Ukrainians lived in that mass. Or draw a circle around where 80% of the Uzbekis lived in that mass. Probably pretty easy. Could you draw a circle around a contiguous area where 80% of the African Americans lived in the United States? You really couldn't. So any kind of formation of an ethno-nationalist state would involve moving massive people around, which is already dangerous if we're talking about relatively unvaluable land masses sitting out in Eastern Europe somewhere. But add on to the fact that if we're getting Richard Spencer type ethnostates in the way that he wants them, again, not like Indian reservations, but actually sovereign states, what we're talking about when we talk about population exchanges is the coordination and seizing of trillion-dollar pieces of real estate that will change hands between controllers based on how many people of a certain skin color live there. I mean, that essentially puts bullseyes on the heads of any number of populations that, if they could be made to go away, would suddenly net the people who destroyed them a huge amount of power and wealth. I mean, that's just setting up a disaster of epic proportions. And I've talked to cool-headed alt-right people who are all about this, like, we're going to be the new Amish thing. And they want something more akin, like I said, to the Indian reservations. It's sort of plausible. And, sometimes when I'm talking to them, I could imagine, a cool-headed leader somehow forming an exodus of people to a designated area in Canada or maybe Montana where they could live in peace as a relatively undisturbed population inside the United States. But that's not coming from anybody remotely connected to Spencer. I mean, the guy is talking about lunatic space fantasies. And I feel, regardless of how Sargon did, his partner Styx Hexenhammer was really very much more on point about this. He was able to really point out the weaknesses in Richard Spencer's vision. And I think even though Styx was broadly on Sargon's side, I think he also acknowledged some of the weakness of the pure liberalistic stance. He seemed to understand that there was a cultural battle that was lost far before the progressives took over the university system, and that needed to be addressed before the next step could be taken. And this has really gotten me to think. I think it's apparent that the alt-right in its current form is not a sustainable political movement, and that the skeptic community, or the liberalist community, is not a sustainable political movement. These are two nascent collections of political ideas that have formed up in the decline of the Western political order. They are both in themselves incomplete, and the ideology that will come forward, and that I hope will eventually dethrone the disastrous and ruinous plans of the progressives and Marxists, has not been formed yet. The skeptic and alt-right communities have nowhere to go, and I think that the discussion that we saw on Andy Worski's channel demonstrated nothing better than that proposition. Now, and I make fun of Sargon for his looking forward to 2018 liberalist project, but it's really, in many ways, the right idea, if not the right exact direction. This needs to be a time of contemplation, of consideration, of forming up new ideas, of doing the necessary intellectual work to figure out how something human can live in the modern world, to figure out how we can pursue truth, goodness, and beauty outside of a lot of these terrible ideas that were popularized in the 20th century. Everyone in this entire conversation is trying to find an old comforting idea from 50 or 60 years ago that they can blow the dust off and present as the solution, as the way to fix the problem right away. Everyone's looking to present some kind of concept that was written out in the 1920s as their original way forward. But maybe the real solution is to take a broader view of the West, a broader view of our own heritage, to look across not just the most recent ideas or the ones that came from the Enlightenment, but the broad swath of human experience, to figure out exactly where we went wrong. And from that wisdom, do the necessary intellectual work to piece together something that is actually genuinely suited for our age, that can actually do the necessary work to take human dignity and put it on the bridge between our ancestors and our distant descendants. So with that thought, I am going to have to end this after action analysis. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and a good night.